Dear children, we will move on to the last topic of the chapter, economic reforms. In the last few classes, we were learning about the economic reform policies such as liberalization, privatization, globalization, etc. Now, we are moving on to the last topic of the chapter, that is an appraisal of the liberalization, privatization and globalization policies. An appraisal of LPG policies. When we make an appraisal of LPG policies, we have to discuss about both arguments in favor of LPG policies and arguments against LPG policies. So, both merits as well as demerits we have to discuss. First, we will move on to arguments in favor of economic reforms. So, economic reforms mainly discusses about the three policies such as liberalization, privatization and globalization. Now, let us see what are the arguments in favor of liberalization, privatization and globalization. Just to make a quick recall of all liberalization, privatization and globalization policies. Liberalization means removal of all kinds of trade restrictions and giving more freedom to the private sector enterprises. Then globalization means economic interdependence of one economy over the other. There are also free movement of goods and services from one country to the other country, and India opening the markets to other countries in the world. Removing all kinds of tariff and non-tariff barriers. Then comes privatization. There we have learned about disinvestment. Selling the whole of government enterprises to the private enterprises or selling a part of or share to the public enterprises. This is what you have learned about privatization. So, make a quick review of all those concepts to your mind, then we will discuss about the arguments in favor of economic reforms. Now, the first point here is, with the economic reforms or with the introduction of LPG policy, we experienced an increasing rate of economic growth. The first point, first argument in favor of LPG policy is we experienced an increasing rate of economic growth. So, how do we measure the increasing rate of economic growth? Now, look at this figures, you will understand. 1980-81, the growth of GDP was 5.6%. Now, in 2017, it has increased to 6.7%, and in 2018-19, it has again increased to 7.2%. It is just because of the LPG policy which was adopted by the government. So, this increasing trend of economic growth is a positive sign. Now, during the reform period in 1991, let us see what all happened in agricultural sector, industrial sector and service sector, because you know that the contribution of each sector to the GDP is very important, right? Therefore, we can see what all things happened in agricultural sector, what was the contribution of agricultural sector, industrial sector and service sector. Now, agricultural sector during the reform period, its growth declined. What was the reason for the decline in the growth rate? That we will discuss now itself when I explain about the arguments against LPG policy. Now, even though there was an increase in the economic growth rate, it is not necessary that increase in the economic growth rate should come only from the agricultural sector. You know that GDP is measured with three sectors: agricultural sector, industrial sector and service sector. So, in these three sectors we measure the GDP. Now, among these three sectors during the reform period, the performance of agricultural sector was not up to the mark, it was declining. Now, second one, industrial sector. In industrial sector, there was a wide fluctuation in the growth rate. What do you mean by that? Ups and downs was experienced in the industrial sector. So, it was not a steady growth. That is what you have to understand from this particular point. Now comes the next one, service sector. Service sector reported growth rate. So this is how we measure the performance of agricultural sector, industrial sector and the service sector. This is with regard to the reform period in 1991. Now when we take the period of 2012-2015, we are learning the two periods here. In agricultural sector, the growth rate was high. That means during the reform period, agricultural sector was experiencing a decline in the growth rate. So that was corrected, and in the year 2012 and 2015, agricultural sector experienced a high growth rate. Now let us see what is with regard to industrial sector. There was a decline in the growth rate of industrial sector. There was a decline in the growth rate of industrial sector. So these are the fluctuations which you can find in the industrial, agricultural and service sector. But one thing is there, we experience an increase in the economic growth rate with the reform period. There will be fluctuations in the three different sectors, but what is the result that we got? We experienced an increase in the economic growth rate. Now service sector, there was highest ever growth rate. So that may be one reason for an increase in the economic growth rate. So there will be fluctuations in these three sectors, but overall we experience an increase in the economic growth rate. So during 2012-2015 period of time, the service sector was experiencing a rapid growth rate. Okay. Now that is the first point. Now the second point, argument in favor of the LPG policy. So what is the first argument in favor of LPG policy is increase in the economic growth rate, and we learned about how different sectors experienced the growth rate in different time periods. Now the next point is, next argument in favor is inflow of foreign investment. Now you know, with the globalization and liberalization policy, the companies in abroad or the private investors, they were given freedom to make investments in our country. So what happened? Foreign direct investment increased from about US dollar. So we are giving the measurement or value in terms of US dollar. US dollar 100 million in 1990-91 to US dollar 73.5 billion in 2014-15. So you can just imagine what kind of a growth rate did India experience in the foreign direct investment from the reform period to 2014-2015. The amount is increased from US dollar 100 million to US dollar 73.5 billion in 2014-15. So you have learned about foreign direct investment in balance of payment in a detailed manner. So you know what is a foreign direct investment. So just as we are free to make investments in the foreign countries also make investments, the foreign investors also make investments in our country. So this goes for the flow of foreign exchange. That is why the amount has increased from the year 1991 to 2014-15. So increase in the foreign investment, flow of foreign investment. Now, so along with that, in the year 2014, September 2014, India initiated a policy known as Make in India policy. Make in India policy increased the foreign direct investment flow in India by 48% overall. Now we will move on to the third argument in favor of LPG policy. The third argument is rise in the foreign exchange reserves. You know what is a foreign exchange reserve? The foreign exchange that we have within us is known as the foreign exchange reserves. You have very well learned about the foreign exchange reserves in foreign exchange market. Now the foreign exchange reserve from about US dollar 6 billion in 1991, it has increased to about US dollar 321 billion in 2014-2015. So just a very high increase in the foreign exchange reserve. So India was the top among the different countries in the world to hold the foreign exchange reserve. So it was the largest foreign exchange reserve among other foreign countries in the world during that time period, because from this you can understand in 1990-91 the foreign exchange reserve in terms of US dollar was 6 billion, but in 2014-15 it has increased to US dollar 321 billion. So that much foreign exchange reserve India had. Now next argument in favor is rise in exports. Definitely there will be rise in export due to the liberalization and globalization policy, because Indian market is open to the world market. India is free to trade. India has to trade with the other countries in the world. So Indian export increased during the reform period, especially in automobile parts, engineering goods, IT software and textiles. So export were seen mainly in these areas. Now we will move on to the next argument in favor of economic reform. Next argument is control on inflation. Now you know that during the reform period so many tax reforms were also introduced. Tax reforms. Can you just recollect what was a tax reform? There was a habit for the people to evade the tax. Tax evasion was very common. So in order to reduce a tax evasion, what government did? Government reduced the taxes. Therefore it was helpful for the people. People could bear the tax rates. So the tax reforms helped in controlling the inflation. Tax reforms. Due to the tax reforms, people began to pay the taxes on time, because the tax rates were reduced. People were very apt in the payment of the tax. So when people pay the tax, what will happen? The amount of money is going to the government as revenue. Therefore their spending, aggregate demand will be less. If the aggregate demand is less, what happens? The increase in the money supply can be controlled. When the money supply is controlled, definitely inflation can also be controlled. You have learned it in money and banking. Now next is increase in the role of private sector. Due to the new economic policy of privatization, liberalization and globalization, the role of private sector began to increase, especially due to privatization. The role of private sector began to increase. Then under this particular point, what explanation is you can give? Removal of licensing and trade restrictions. All kind of licensing and trade restrictions were removed. Industries need not wait for license to start to expand and to produce diversified products. You have learned it, isn't it? So the new system of licensing and the removal of trade restrictions, no trade restrictions. These two helped the private sectors to grow during the reform period. Then the next one is criticism of economic reforms. So what all points we learned under arguments in favor of new economic policy? Increase in the growth rate, then increase in the foreign investment, then comes the third one, rise in the foreign exchange reserves, then rise in the export. After that, control of inflation and increase in the role of private sectors. This is with regard to the arguments in favor of economic reforms. Now we will move on to arguments against economic reforms. Just as argument in favor of economic reforms, we have arguments against economic reforms. Let us see what are they. Criticisms of economic reforms, which means arguments against economic reforms. The first one is growing unemployment. Unemployment was growing day by day. Even though we experienced the growth rate in GDP and economic growth rate, that growth rate was not able to generate the employment opportunities. It failed to generate the employment opportunities. Even though there was growth rate, that growth rate failed to absorb the people to the employment opportunities. Growth rate was there, but there was unemployment. So that is known as jobless growth. So people were unemployed. There was growth rate, but people was unemployed, because an example which I can give you is industrial sector was declining, which means what, number of industries and its performance was very low. So therefore you can understand the number of people which are absorbed in the industrial sector is low. So these are the reasons. So even though the growth rate was very high, we experienced a good growth rate. That growth rate was not able to absorb the people to employment opportunities. It failed to generate sufficient employment opportunities. Now the next point, neglect of agriculture. Now when we learned about arguments in favor of the new economic policy, first point we learned increase in the economic growth rate. In that we categorized the performance of agricultural sector, industrial sector and service sector. There we saw in the initial stages agricultural sector, its growth rate declined. At that time I told you, I will explain when we learn about the arguments against new economic policy. What was the reason for the low performance of agricultural sector during the initial period of economic reforms? So reason we can see. So during the reform period, agricultural sector was neglected. That is the next argument against new economic policy. That is the main reason why during the initial period of reforms, agricultural sector faced a setback. There was a decline in the agricultural sector growth rate. Now let us see what is the reason behind that. Reason behind that is neglect of agricultural sector, and that is one of the argument against new economic policy. Now let us see how the agricultural sector was neglected. Point number 1, reduction of public investment. Here public investment means government initiative, government investment in irrigation, power, roads, market linkages, etc. The agricultural sector can work properly only if the government provides certain facilities to the farmers, such as irrigation, power, road, market linkages, etc. If there is no sufficient amount of water, irrigation facilities should be there. Then power supply should be there. Then the next is roads, transportation of agricultural products. For that, road should be properly managed. Then market linkages, connection between one market to the other. All these are necessary. So there was no initiative, lack of initiative from the government for making investments in such areas, caused for the neglect of agricultural sector. Now next we will move on to the removal of subsidies. Removal of subsidies. Now you know what is subsidies. Subsidies are a great help for the farmers, because they will be getting the products at a price less than what is being given in the market. So during the reform period, the government removed the subsidies, because subsidies were initiated only during the planning period. During the reform period, subsidies were removed. Now you know what will happen if the subsidies are removed. What will happen? You can think of it. The situation of marginal and small farmers will be a worse situation, right? Because they always depend on the subsidies for doing the agriculture. If it is removed, they will not be able to survive. Therefore, the removal of subsidy badly affected the small and marginal farmers. Next one is shift towards cash crops. Now, due to the economic reforms, India is engaged in export with other countries. So, frequently it is engaged with exports with other countries. So, instead of producing the food grains, India produced, during the economic reforms, India gave importance to cash crops due to export oriented policy strategy. What do you mean by that? Encouraging more and more exports as a part of globalization. So because of that, India gave more importance to which kind of crops? Cash crops instead of food crops. So this resulted in the rise in the price of food grains also. Then comes the next one is reduction in the import duties on agricultural products. Import duties on agricultural products were reduced. And import duties on agricultural products means what? Those products which are coming from outside to India, its import duties were reduced. Therefore, it encouraged more flow of agricultural products even from outside. Therefore, that also affected the agricultural sector of India. That is also a neglect to agricultural sector in India. And removal of minimum support price. MSP is minimum support price. The government also removed the minimum support price. Therefore, it troubled the farmers. They were not able to get the support price for their production. Okay, so these are the points which comes under neglect of agriculture. That is reduction of the public investment, removal of subsidies, shift towards the cash crops and reduction in import. Now next we will move on to the low level of industrial growth. Just as we learned in arguments in favor of LPG policy, there even though we learned that economic growth rate was increasing, when we examined sector wise, we learned that in industrial sector there was fluctuation. So what is the reason for that fluctuation? That is the great flow of goods and capital from developed countries. Cheaper imports replaced demand for domestic goods. Due to the globalization, there was a great flow of goods from outside countries. Therefore, cheaper goods replaced the demand for the domestic goods. Our goods were not at all demanded by the people because cheaper goods they got from outside. Best example is China products. Okay. Next one is lack of infrastructure facilities. Lack of infrastructure facilities. Government was not able to provide good infrastructure facilities for our industries to grow. There was lack of power, lack of technology, lack of capital and so on. It affected our industrial growth a lot. Then comes non-tariff barriers by developed countries. Now, India took away all kinds of trade restrictions. All quota restrictions were removed by India on its export. All kinds. India was exporting any amount of goods and services to other countries. It abolished all kinds of quota restrictions. But developed countries like USA, they did not remove their quota restrictions on imports from India. So whatever India is selling to those countries, when India is selling to those countries, for those countries it is import. Those countries began to have quota restrictions when we exported our goods. So what will happen? Our foreign exchange will become less, isn't it? That means we removed all kinds of quota restrictions, but developed countries like USA, they were very conscious. Whatever goods were exported from India to USA, they had some quota restrictions there. They did not buy all those goods which were sent from India. They maintained the quota restrictions. So that was also a problem for India. Now the next point is ineffective disinvestment policy. Ineffective disinvestment policy. You know what is disinvestment policy? Selling a part or a share of the public enterprises, government enterprises to the private sector. So to the public is known as, or to the people is known as disinvestment. Disinvestment was not at all effective. Then not only that, the amount obtained through the disinvestment was used by the government to compensate the shortage of government revenue. So government was trying to use that amount which they got from the disinvestment not for any developmental process, but for meeting the revenue. So once again, the amount obtained through disinvestment were used by the government to compensate the shortage of revenue that government had, rather than using it for developmental projects. So all the amount which government received through disinvestment were not at all used for any kind of developmental projects. Instead of that, it was used for meeting the purposes or revenue of the government to meet the expenditure or to cover the shortage of government revenue. Then comes the next one, ineffective tax policy. Tax were reduced in order to reduce the burden of the people. So when the burden was reduced, people were apt in payment of tax. But the problem was government revenue reduced, because tax is the only way which government can get the revenue. So when the tax was reduced, what happened? The scope of raising the revenue was less. So once again, ineffective tax policy, tax reduction decreased the scope of raising the revenue. Then comes the next one. So next, another point under this is tax incentives to foreign investors. The foreign investors were encouraged to make investments in our country by giving some tax incentives. That tax incentive also affected the revenue of the government. We did that for encouraging the investors from outside, but that kind of incentives affected our revenue. So tax reduction and tax incentives both affected the revenue of the government during that time period. Then comes the next one, spread of consumerism. So due to globalization and liberalization policy, the government of our country or the producers of our country was encouraged to produce more luxurious items and other items which were superior in nature, items of superior consumption, because we are competing with other countries in the world. So we were engaged in the production of luxuries and items of superior consumption. Then the next one, unbalanced growth. The growth was not in a balanced manner. Growth was observed only in some selected areas of services like IT, finance, entertainment, travel, hospitality service, then trade, telecommunication, etc. Only in certain areas the growth was concentrated. So that was one of the major defects of the new economic policy. So we learned about the arguments against the new economic policy. It affected the agricultural sector badly. Then also it had an adverse effect on industrial sector. Then comes the next one, ineffective disinvestment policy. Then the next one, ineffective tax policy. Then spread of consumerism and unbalanced growth. Hope it is clear to you. And with this we have come to an end of the chapter. Learn the exercise from Sandeep Garg. Thank you.